Okay. Very briefly on each one of them. The first of the original seven pillars of integral education is, and before going into them, I must first acknowledge in full honoring Professor Pedro Noguera, who is the actual co-author of all of this work as well. And especially the first four of the original seven pillars were his inspiration and his deliverance, which he had taken forth in advising the governments of some countries in Latin America as how they can accelerate the development and modification and overhaul of their own education systems. So this is how it began. And back in 2007, Professor Noguera and I then got together and explored those original four, and then we expanded them. I added the integral operating system as an overall construct in order to have something which we knew could grow, organically grow, and not simply be subject matter or an operation approach to the teaching of a general theme, but also the actual structure of the organization of information and knowledge. So to Dr. Professor Pedro Noguera, thank you again, brother, always. The first pillar is called education of the whole person. So much of the time we have faced this issue of how much of a life are we supposed to affect when we have a system, any kind of institution. How much of a person's life are we really responsible to address if we are to provide something that is supportive to them, something that is a social benefit, something that is a resource to them? Well, when it comes to education, you cannot provide education in a sterile, fragmented way and expect that it have its optimal utility, its optimal viability, certainly its optimal effectiveness. You have to take a perspective which is that of the whole person: spirit, mind, body, emotions, environment, temporality, their time relationships, their culture intrinsically, their mechanics of learning, how their perceptions are wired for the world. So this is the first of the pillars. And in the first phase of organizing a system of integral education, one must declare integrality. And integrality on an individual basis means whole personness. Otherwise, it would not even be integral no matter what else it is that we wanted to put into the mix. So whole person education is essential. The second pillar is called education for empowerment. Now, empowerment is kind of a 1980s word, I believe, thereabouts, and came into a lot of popular usage because it represented a way of increasing a sense of identification with positively intended social programs, and also a way of understanding what is necessary to open channels of compassion and intimacy and in the delivery of social services, and even in the engagement of others in the process, in the dynamics of leadership as we understand leadership. And yet we still live in a culture that is continually disempowering, while it is also empowering. Certainly when we look at events post 9/11 of 2001, we can say that there's been radical disempowerment of the population by the usurpation and the abnegation of what we've previously referred to as universal civil liberties, all in the name of fighting a so-called war on terror. So this is a dastardly process of disempowerment of the population. So when we have an educational system that has one of its pillars as the education for empowerment, we also recognize that part of what we're having to do is address what has been this retrification dynamic in the consciousness of the population to push people back into states of less sense of empowerment. So it is a great hurdle to overcome. And to go forward with that empowerment is also to go forward with principles of engagement which are far beyond competition, winning and losing, dominating or being dominated. Instead, empowerment comes to take on a much more modernized, holistic construct, because my empowerment cannot exist at your loss. My empowerment must be unified with you. It is collective empowerment. The third pillar is education for development. Development, what are the needs of society? What are the needs for an individual who goes through developmental stages from, as they say, from cradle to grave? Or do they? Do they have that opportunity? Does a person and does a society have the opportunity to provide for continuous growth and re-engineering evolution of the self? Through various phases of life, various phases of learning, various phases of activity, various phases of service. The gaining of wisdom itself is a channel of development, which unfortunately is denied the vast majority of people in the Western culture. The next one is what we call education for global citizenship. And global citizenship is really with that understanding that the potential is there through the technologic linkages that we have and the low cost, ever increasing low cost of access to technology of communications. It's possible to link all of the major, all of the continents, all of the countries, and most of the even village level environments on the planet with means of connectivity and communications and sharing with others. And therefore, a part of a global family and the emergence of that global family to be cultivated, to be nurtured. Global citizenship. Of course, the harder side of that is the recognition that our problems of mismanagement, of injudicious, of greedy, and discompassionate use of our time and our experience here on this planet has led to the creation and the emergence of global scale problems, no longer local in my backyard kind of problems, but global scale problems. And therefore, we know that it requires a sense of global membership, familyhood, citizenship, in order to face and create the solutions to these global scale problems. Those are the first four. Next came the fifth pillar, which is education for genius. What is education for genius? Well, we first of all begin with the premise, which is a very false premise, but it comes from the elitist legacy of differentiating one from another with notions of superiority, albeit false in the first place, and secondly, falsified when they have become institutionalized perspectives and operatives of the science systems, the education systems, the political systems, with a notion of who is on top, who is better than another. So when we apply that to the issue of intelligence, human intelligence, we have also stratified these notions of human intelligence, and we call those who reside at some sort of top geniuses. Yet genius is a capacity of access, a field of access, which can be taught how to access this field, and thus all people can experience this process of genius. And there's richness in a curriculum that takes that approach. Now our responsibility is to access, activate, catalyze that emergent genius in all people. Thus, the education system as a pillar for genius. The next one is education for enlightenment. This is kind of cool. Does not have to be religious, doesn't have to be Eastern versus Western. Enlightenment means awakening to the light of truth. And education for enlightenment has in its structure, approach, an understanding of aspects of consciousness and aspects of awareness and aspects of engagement and aspects of transformation, aspects of connection, aspects of healing. In fact, what are all of the 7 additional pillars of integral education that I mentioned in just the previous segment here, all emerge in optimized state through the foundational approach to enlightenment itself. And again, I'll explain much more of that in detail later. The final of these 7 original is education for service. What good is awakening? What good is genius? What good is development, whole personness, empowerment, global citizenship? What good is all of that if it is not put into service, in particularly selfless service? So education for service is actually higher than the education for enlightenment. If one were to put a values hierarchical assignment to it, to be able to attain a state of awareness and quality of life, fulfillment in life, where one can give forth selfless service without regard to the selfishness of self-aggrandizement or self-reward. That service unto itself is its reward. That service in the mode of contributing to the needs and the evolution of society is the awareness that all share. And thus it is the motivation that all share as well. So these are the 7 original pillars of integral education. Just in a quick sort of run-through review, for those of you who may not have the opportunity, nor the inclination, or the time to review the previous segments completely. I hope this is useful.
What are the new ones that we're about to?
So the new ones, what are these new ones? All right, well, when Professor Noguera and I were getting together a couple years ago and taking these principles and putting them into the first draft of a book which we are producing together, and I ran through the first 7 that I'd just given you, he said, "Where's creativity there?" And I said, oopsie. Actually, the education for creativity was first kind of prompted by his wanting to be a little bit politically correct, because enlightenment may turn off some people as a construct. But once we began to discuss it much more, I said, no, it's one unto itself. Enlightenment is real. You cannot deny the need for enlightenment of the whole planet. And at the same time, the focus on enlightenment, the focus on creativity is somewhat different. So that was the first of the additional to emerge. So if we were looking at a progression, we would actually take enlightenment and hold that in position number 6, but we would insert education for creativity into position number 7, and then would come education for service as pillar number 8. But that's a little bit of a technical issue for the moment. Education for creativity is, again, something that people at Harvard School of Education and places like that introduced as an emergent megatrend, for example. Education for leadership, education for cooperation, the matrix organization, these kinds of things where people have taken approaches historically over these last several decades to understanding what are the emerging trends that set the tone for society. Well, education, the management of creativity has emerged in the last decade as what you might call the gold standard, or the most popular way of leading edge development of business enterprises and deliverance of economic gain to a society. So we have introduced education for creativity in a different approach than what has come from that end. And yet, creativity is something that has to be fostered, it has to be encouraged, it has to be bridged into all aspects of our lives. So again, much more to go into regarding that one. And to more succinctly mention what the others are: education for consciousness, education for cosmology, education for transcendence, education for healing, education for evolution, and education for unity. So the next segment will be focusing more on education for creativity, elaborating a bit more on that one, and then we'll go into each of the others in succession. I hope this is useful.